Hello again, ladies and gents, and you join me for the third and final part of the Great Fire of London. Here we see a different view of the fire by an unknown Swedish or Flemish artist, looking down Thames this time from behind the London Bridge. And you can see that Old St Paul's is more or less all but gone, and as we saw or spoke about in the previous video, many of the people are fleeing across the river to get away. The fire had taken hold of the city, and now we're going to examine exactly how the fire was eventually stopped, and then London's terrible revenge, which was nasty actually what they did, and then the rebuilding of the city. So join me all again for that part.
The king now rode through the fire. He carried 100 gold pounds in a pouch swung from his shoulder and scattered coins among the workmen in encouragement.
The king's role in the fire and the rebuilding afterwards is almost the most interesting thing about the Great Fire of London. He got his hands dirty. Here was somebody who was the restored King of England, really presiding over one of the most magnificent, lavish, gay courts in Europe. There he was, going out and personally taking control of this hideous calamity.
The king now gave orders to move the exchequer to Surrey, while his brother James, the Duke of York, called in the navy to fetch gunpowder. Pulling down buildings was to no avail. Sailors from the fleet and workers from the dockyards at Woolwich and Deptford were now ordered to blow up buildings in order to create fire breaks. It was the only way to save what remained of London. At last, on Wednesday morning, after 4 days, there were signs of hope. The wind was stilled, and the fire breaks seemed to be working.
The Duke of York came down. He was actually a bencher of the Inner Temple, and he came and presided over the last series of explosions, last bits of demolition, which finally stopped the fire dead in its tracks.
Although sporadic small fires still raged, by midday on Wednesday, September the 6th, 1666, the general conflagration had at last been put out. Samuel Pepys climbed to the top of Barking Steeple to survey the damage.
There saw the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Everywhere great fires, oil cellars and brimstone, the fire being spread as far as I could see it.
He goes to see where his school was. The school had been so important, his formation of the school, which had been Milson's school, the school from which he'd gone to see Charles I executed, the school which really formed Pepys's mind and made him into the very able man he was. So his whole childhood, his scenery has gone, and for Pepys, the pattern of your life, the shape of the life of your life is very, very important. And I think for him to see all that just gone was powerful and depressing.
Despite the devastation, there were only 6 official deaths during the fire of London. Amongst them, the baker's maid, the old woman sheltering in St Paul's, and an 80-year-old watchmaker who had been too frightened to leave his own home. But as those who survived looked out over their ruined city, it was as if there was only one question to ask: who hath done this? After the fire, a ballad was sold on the streets commemorating the destruction. It was called London Mourns in Ashes. People had lost their homes and their livelihoods. A printer who had laboured for years over his 12 volumes of poetry in honour of Charles I saw the entire edition burnt. Alderman John Jeffreys of Bread Street Ward lost £20,000 worth of tobacco. Joseph Curtin, Pepys' bookseller, was made bankrupt, moving from £8,000 in profit to £3,000 in debt. A year later, Pepys wrote,
I hear Curtin, my bookseller, poor man, is dead. I believe of grief for his losses by the fire.
And now back to Samuel Pepys, my favourite historical Londoner, a little bit more on him. This is Samuel Pepys' bust, which is in Pepys Garden in Seething Lane. This is the Navy office where Pepys worked. He lived in Seething Lane and worked here. This survived the fire, interestingly enough. The Great Fire of London, it survived. Also, interestingly enough, later on, when Pepys was older, it didn't survive another fire and Pepys' home was burned then. But this is Pepys' world as he knew it. During the fire, Pepys, thinking that the house was going to be burned, Parmesan cheese and wine being very valuable, he buried that along with some deeds and documents in his yard. Luckily, he was able to come back and retrieve it without everything having been burned around him. Here we are, Samuel Pepys himself. As I've said before in the previous documentary, Pepys and his wife Elizabeth got safely away from the fire over onto the south bank. Pepys sent Elizabeth, his wife, into the countryside with several £100 at Woolwich, which was the countryside in those days, to stay with friends away like safely until things had got more back to normal. And I think he enjoyed the freedom of a footloose and fancy-free man as well, so that was probably another reason. This man doesn't really get much mention. His name is Will Hubert. He started off as a servant to Pepys and Elizabeth in their house when they were newly married and young. And Will would later become to be one of Pepys' greatest friends. And it's through this man, carrying out Pepys' instructions and doing it carefully, that the diaries survive today. So this is Will Hubert. He spent a lot of time alongside Pepys. They went through many different things together. They were more friends than master and servant come the end, and Pepys left Will Hubert very well off in his will. Pepys died quite a wealthy man. So that's our little snippet of Samuel Pepys and a little interesting tableau that I wanted to tell you about him. With his wine and his Parmesan cheese. And on to the next part we go. And now to London's Unjust Justice, and the innocent man they hanged for a crime he did not commit. Let me introduce you all to Robert Hubert, or Robert Hubert, as he was called, or sometimes called, born in 1640 and executed at Tyburn on the 27th of October 1666. Hubert he was a Frenchman, a watchmaker, as quite clearly simple-minded as they would have called him in those days. Basically, what Hubert was, he was one of those people that confessed to crimes they didn't commit. And this is exactly what he did. Evidence later turned up about Hubert that shows that he probably wasn't even in the country when the fire began. The English, we were looking for someone to blame, and as I said before, Thomas Fariner, the cause of the fire, didn't want that person of blame to be him or any member of his family. At the time in England, Catholics were highly despised, so Catholics were the ideal ones to blame, and this is a contemporary depiction that you see from the time. Hubert changed his confession several times, but this is the one that they went with, of a Jesuit priest handing Hubert a rudimentary or rustic fireball to throw through the window of Thomas Fariner's baker's shop. So the plot set, the person blamed, and the religion of choice blamed for that one as well. And here we are, Popish damnable plot. This is an original article from the time as well, and this basically lays the complete and utter blame at the door of Robert Hubert and the Catholics. Hubert first confessed to starting the fire at Westminster. However, this story proved unsatisfactory and completely untrue, and he changed his story upon learning that the fire never even reached Westminster. Having learned that the fire started in Pudding Lane in the house of the King's baker Thomas Fariner, he then claimed to have thrown a crude fire grenade through an open window of Fariner's bakery. He claimed to have acted with accomplices who stopped the watercocks to sabotage the effort to put out the fire that Hubert started. Hubert's confessed motive was apparently that he was a French spy and an agent of the Pope. As I've said, it turned out, and this was proven later, that at the time of the starting of the fire, Hubert wasn't even in the country. He wasn't even here when the fire started. A fact that was later testified to by the captain of a Swedish ship called the Maid of Stockholm, and he stated that he personally landed Hubert ashore 2 days after the outbreak of the fire. Also, Hubert, having never seen the Fariner's bakery, what he didn't know is that there were no lower story or accessible lower story windows for him to have thrown the fireball through. Thomas Fariner omitted to mention this fact. The bakery no longer existed to prove or disprove the fact. Robert Hubert's confession is often attributed to simplicity or an inability to understand what he was actually confessing to. Worries and qualms were raised at the time that he wasn't in his right mind. They were quickly quashed and got rid of, and he was blamed. But even had he been in the country to start the fire, it is so unlikely that he could have done it, because apart from being, shall we call, mentally deficient, he was also quite badly crippled, to a point where doing such an act would have been near or impossible for him. Well, despite the many flaws in Robert Hubert's confession, a scapegoat was needed. Fariner wanted a scapegoat, and even King Charles II himself wanted a scapegoat, because believe it or not, at first, King Charles himself was blamed or suspected for having instigated the fire in order to punish the people of London for the execution of his father. Before Hubert came forward and confessed, every foreigner was at risk, and quite a few were attacked, including the murder of a Frenchman whose tennis balls were mistaken for fireballs. Robert Hubert was tried at Westminster Hall and found guilty of high treason against the realm. As such, he would have been imprisoned for a short time, and then he would have been taken to the place of execution. This is a depiction from the time of Robert Hubert being transported to Tyburn Gallows, where he was hanged for his crime that he didn't commit. The London mob accompanied and jeered him all the way, doing the usual thing of throwing stones and pebbles and muck. And execution was like a Mayday fair for some people in those days, unfortunately. Unusually, Robert wasn't sentenced to the full sentence of hanging, drawing and quartering, which shows that there may have been some leniency shown because they knew he was innocent. That's not known, that's just my conjecture. Anyway, Robert was hanged at Tyburn on the 27th of October 1666. Even up until the time of his execution, even some high up people, and we had newspapers and broadsheets in those days, and some of them didn't think it was Robert. As we're going to see here, the London Gazette suggests that some put the disaster down to chance, and the original Gazette article says, notwithstanding suspicion, the manner of burning all along in a train and so blown forwards in all its way by strong winds make us conclude the whole was an effect of an unhappy chance, or to speak better, the heavy hand of God. And that's what I said before, a lot of people thought that it was God's vengeance on London for being so sinful. But yeah, as I say, Robert was hanged on the 27th of October 1666. Following Robert's execution, his body was due to be handed to the Company of Barber Surgeons for dissection, but it didn't get that far. The angry Londoners got hold of the body and it was torn to shreds. It was hoped after Robert's death that the talk of plots and conspiracies would die with him. In 1667, the need for scapegoats had died down, and the fire was officially attributed to the hand of God, a great wind and a very dry season. One source attributes the accident to a spark falling upon a bale of straw in the bakery of Thomas Fariner, and many assume the spark to have come from the oven that Thomas Fariner failed to extinguish properly at night time. Rising from the ashes, the rebuilding of the City of London, a little on the men that did it, and we'll be seeing that through their eyes and their world, and be seeing it through my experiences through doing what I've done in the page. This map shows away how much of the city was burned away. A big swathe of the city. Everything in red is what was destroyed. Sir Christopher Wren, another one of my favourite historical Londoners, a very interesting man, a complete genius of an architect, a workaholic. Unusually for the time, Sir Christopher Wren lived to well over the age of 90, which was unusual for a Londoner and for that time, because London wasn't the safest and cleanest place to be. But as you see, Sir Christopher here with his pride and joy, St Paul's Cathedral over to the left in the window. That was his penultimate thing that he really did pride himself on, and rightfully so. But many of the churches in the City of London that are still around today were built by Wren, and he also played a role in advising and being the architect of or advisor to the rebuilding of many other buildings in London. such as the Royal Naval College and things like that, when that became to be built later on. Sir Robert Hooke, another genius of an architect, a mathematician, a theologian, a multi-talented, multi-skilled man. Sir Robert Hooke is responsible, along with Sir Christopher Wren, but mostly Sir Robert Hooke, for the building of the monument. And now on to my favourite Londoner, Samuel Pepys, and he'll tell us a little bit about his world through his eyes and the rebuilding of the City of London. Here we go.
Saw all the town burned, and a miserable sight of Paul's church, with all the roofs fallen and the body of the choir fallen into St. Faith's. Paul's school also, Ludgate and Fleet Street, and a good part of the temple the like. So to Mr. Creed's lodging, and there find him laid down upon a bed, the house all unfurnished because of the fire. There I did borrow a shirt of him and washed. People are speaking their thoughts variously about the fire, and to the rebuilding of the city. February the 1st, 1667, up and by water from the Tower to Whitehall. The first time that I have gone thence by water for several months. Meeting with Mr. Povey, he carried me to Mr. Streeter's, the famous history painter, whom I have often heard of, and there found him and Dr. Wren. By and by comes Sir Robert Viner to ask Dr. Wren about measuring out the streets according to Dr. Wren's proposals for building of the city. March the 20th. Today I spoke with Mr. May, who tells me that the design of the rebuilding the city do go on apace, and by his description it will be mighty handsome and to the satisfaction of the people.
Here we see the plans for post-fire London, with nice, straight, neatly laid out streets, preferably wide, much wider apart than the old ones, and the houses were to be built from brick or stone. Not everything was stuck to rigorously like that, but the streets were made a lot safer than they were. And you've heard Samuel Pepys speak about Dr. Wren, and I think Samuel Pepys was a little bit awestruck by Dr. Wren, to be honest with you, from his writings. And here we see the newly laid out streets and the monument, much wider apart, and the houses are built from brick and stone, which made the spread of a fire far less easier for it to happen like that. The old lath and plaster and timber framed houses and narrow streets really acted as a tunnel effect, particularly with the wind, and hence why the fire got so out of control as it did. Here you see old St. Paul's on the hill of the city, and the old City of London pre-fire. Pretty much everything that we're looking at here was wiped away by the fire. And here you see an illustration of the new St. Paul's, pretty much as it would have looked in Wren's day. And you see here it's the highest building around it. There's nothing else higher around it at the time, but now many of the buildings are a lot higher than this, or very nearly so. Once upon a time you could have seen this from all over London. This is one of my favourite little images. It just shows the inner construction of the dome, and anyone that's watched my pages will have seen that I've been up and on the inside of this, up onto the roof, but not into the Whispering Gallery where you can see the painted things. That's closed, unfortunately. St. Paul's, since it was built, has stood as a great symbol, a stubborn old symbol in London, and you see it here in the Second World War. The Germans wanted it gone, Hitler wanted it gone, and it refused to go. With the help of the Watch, the people that saved it, St. Paul's refused to be destroyed. A fact that I think would probably please Sir Christopher Wren quite a lot. And here we are onto the London of their world, but through my eyes. What we're going to be seeing now is Wren buildings. This is the view from Southwark Bridge. St. Michael Walbrook. St Margaret Patterns, the Royal Naval College and Royal Naval Hospital, with the modern modern buildings of the city in the middle. St Dunstan's in the east, my favourite ruined church garden. Pardon me. St Paul's at night time. I took this picture when I first started the page. St Michael Paternoster. And there we are, that's some of the replaced world of theirs through my eyes. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And the last little part of part 3, which is our final part, is going to be an interview with Mr. Samuel Pepys himself. So I'll pass you on to Samuel Pepys now.
I escaped the fire via a small boat on the Thames. The river was a saviour to many during the blaze. It was quite dark at night, as candles were our only source of light. However, during the fire, it was most bright indeed. I wrote the diary for my own personal use, and it was my most prized and secret possession, aside from my cheese, which I buried to keep safe during the fire. My work brought me to London, as I was an administrator for the Royal Navy and a member of the King's Parliament. I was most frightened by the fire, as any man should be. Never before had I seen such flames rising from the town of London. Much misery and sadness overwhelmed me when I saw the destruction of St. Paul's. As a Member of Parliament, I was able to discuss solutions to the fire of London with the King in person. Your paper would be filthy too after 300 years. But I must admit, our bleaching methods were inferior to yours. Goodbye, Year 2.
Hope you all enjoyed the documentary, ladies and gents. If you did, you know what to do. Please give it a like and a share. It's important that we remember these things, and the Great Fire of London was a big one. Thank you all for watching. Take care all.